Keep your crunching to a bare minimum, mister.
Yes, sir.
All right, let's get going. We got a lot to cover today. We're still running a little bit behind. As usual, we start with business. Don't forget, if you haven't gotten in your historical glossary part 1, that was due on Monday. I will accept it all the way until this coming Monday, next Monday. Make sure you get that in. After that, I don't take late work, okay? Those of you who did it, I gotta say, very impressed with the high quality of work. I'm going to start calling out people for their amazing work. So, you know, if I call you out, it's usually for a good thing. So excellent for those of you who did it. I did give feedback. I've already graded those. So I do want to see improvement over time. If I'm asking you to add more, please find ways to do that. Respond to that feedback, okay? You have another one of these. The second half of your study guide is going to be due this Monday, February 1st by noon. And then here's the really shocking part. Then you have your first exam that's going to be due the following Monday. So you're basically doing all of your exam prep by looking through and completing these historical glossaries. Okay, that's what's going to help prepare you for these exams, and that's coming up quicker than any of us really want. So just realize that's coming down the road. Okay. All right. So we got a lot to cover today, and I want to start with this question. When you hear the word revolution, what comes to mind? Give me 1 or 2 words or a phrase. You got to help me out here. Let's have some participation. What do you think of when you hear the word revolution?
People revolting.
Yeah, you realize that using the exact same word in the definition isn't actually a definition, right, Taj? You're smart enough, man. You know this. You know, and by revolting, do you mean like my son is revolting to me? I love you. I really do. No, that's, you know, I mean, like, you know, I find certain people revolting. I don't think that's what you mean. Let's keep trying. What else comes to mind?
People fighting back against a larger group that is oppressing them.
Do revolutions have to be violent?
No.
Tyler, what do you think? You raise your hand. What do you want to say? Tyler?
I just wanted to say I think of revolutions as on a massive scale.
So change. I love that. That's almost always the word that comes up. Oh, but on a massive scale. So it's not like, you know, you changed your underwear today, I hope. So that wasn't a revolution. Or maybe for some of you it was. I don't know what your thing is, okay? So it has to be on a large scale, massive change. Maybe so, maybe not. What I want to look at today is I want to look at 3 major revolutions that rocked the West and did transform the way that people live their lives, or so it at least seemed at first. Today, I want to talk about first the Industrial Revolution, then the American, and then the French. So these are the 3 major ones that I want to talk about. So first and foremost, the Industrial. Come on. Are you going to change? There we go. Okay. The Industrial Revolution emerged in England about 1750. So this begins just on the cusp of the American Revolution. And you got to realize that the Industrial Revolution is really only taking place in England for about 50 years. So they have a huge advantage over other countries. Before the Industrial Revolution, all work was done by humans or animals, all of it. We got anybody here a gearhead, likes, you know, is a big car fan, loves to work on cars and all that? No gearheads today. Okay. My son likes hanging out with them. Ben, what's a good horsepower for an engine?
200 is pretty medium.
Okay.
400 is good.
So 200, he's saying 200 is about average, 400 is good. That's literally 400 horsepower. That is the power that can be generated by 400 horses in an area the size of your engine. So now with the Industrial Revolution and these new sources sources of power, you're not just replacing human power, but you're adding to it and you're making it more efficient. Now you can produce. This actually begins because England is running out of fuel. By the 1750s, England had cut down all of their forests. You go to England today and there are no forests anymore. If there are, they're being managed. But okay, at the time, everybody heated their home with firewood or charcoal. So you got a problem. If you don't have either of those, you got to find a new source of energy. And so they started to dig into the ground and they started to use a new energy source. And this, of course, this was really brand new to being used as an energy source in the world. But the problem is, most of England is kind of like Florida. It's very flat. It's very much at sea level. So what happens when you start digging into the ground in Florida? What do you hit?
The water table.
Exactly. Very quickly. Excellent, Tyler. So this is where the first engines are developed. If you've ever seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or any railroad movie, or if you've ever seen like a basic oil derrick. So let's take the railroad. You got two guys on each side and one's pushing down and the other is pushing up to make the railway go. That's a basic engine. But you need, instead of humans doing that, you need to find a way to get it to do it on itself. And this is where we get the internal combustion engine. And the guy who really is given credit for this is James Watt. Watt is going to develop this engine to pump the water out of the coal mines so that they can then go in and exploit these resources. This is going to become more and more efficient over time, and pretty soon you can apply that same energy to anything a human can do. And anybody know what the first industry is that always, where the industrial revolution begins? What's the one industry where it always begins?
Railroad.
Nope. Good guess.
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing's a little bit broad. Can you be a little more specific, Tyler? You had something? Textiles. Always, in every single case, the making of clothing. So today in Southeast Asia and Central America, where most of your clothing is coming from, they're now experiencing the Industrial Revolution. This was true in England. It will be true in the United States. It will be true in Europe as well. Okay. So what this does is you just take this simple engine and you attach it by pulley systems, actually by long leather strips, to other looms. And now instead of a human having to do all that weaving and wafting and all, now you have a machine that does that. Here's my question. What happens to the person that used to manufacture those textiles?
Expired.
Yeah, you're unemployed. And now you need to find a new job skill. And we're seeing this still to this day. When I was growing up, we used to actually manufacture cars in the United States with men and women on the lines. Now it is entirely industrialized. It's more robots than people, and it's almost all international and overseas where labor is cheaper. So we're going to see this as we industrialize. Everybody at some point is going to become irrelevant. I mean, I can see the day where there are these MMOs, these massive multi-online players, but instead applied to education. Why can't I just record these lessons? You come to it whenever you damn well want to. You pay a fee for access, and then you take tests at the end. Princeton is doing that. Harvard is doing that. MIT is doing that. That's probably the future of education. And I can just wave my paycheck goodbye. I'm going to have to find a way to adapt when that happens. So, Jacob, you mentioned railroads. That's really going to be the second wave of this. Because once you have manufacturing, you've created a factory, a textile factory, then you have to get materials to that factory, and you have to get the finished products from the factory to the marketplace. That used to be done all by wagons, but that's just not efficient enough. Now you apply that steam engine to the railroad. And this is going to be a revolution in transportation. So the Industrial Revolution is actually 3 revolutions all wrapped up in one. You've got manufacturing that's going to be completely transformed. You're going to have transportation as well that's going to be completely transformed, and communication as well. The Industrial Revolution cannot thrive without all 3 of these. If you're a manufacturer and you don't know what people want, you're not communicating, you're going to be eliminated very quickly. You don't know how much people want, where your goods need to be sent to, where to get the cheapest supply from. That communication is vital. And so just think, in just 20 or 30 years, the speed of life is going to exponentially increase. And if you can imagine kind of what it's like for your grandparents in the digital age, okay? How many of y'all have tried to teach your grandparents or great grandparents about the internet or email or Twitter or any of that? God forbid. Whole lot of fun, isn't it, Taj? Yeah, a lot of you. Usually you run into a lot of these blockades of just like, I don't get it. I just don't get it. My dad still won't get on Facebook because he's convinced that somehow it's going to reach out and steal his credit card numbers. I don't know how that's going to happen, but he's convinced it's going to happen. So he's just not on Facebook. The guy has 3 degrees in engineering, but he won't text. He doesn't know how. Has no idea. He's part of an older generation. Now, we think it's kind of cute, but just you wait. When you get that age, new technology will come that scares you to promise. Promise. And young people will come up with crazy ideas that you won't agree with, and you won't want to change either. And suddenly you're going to realize you turned into your grandma. It will happen to you too, my friends. I promise. So here we've got these revolutions all going on at the same time. Now, these early railroads were dangerous and scary. They're poorly built. They went an average of about 5 miles an hour, and that scared the hell out of people. Just imagine that. Just 5 miles an hour. Now these railroads travel at somewhere between 80 and 120 miles an hour when they're at full steam. Can you imagine how terrifying that would have been? They also were very dangerous because they didn't know the physics. So they'd make these turns that were too sharp and the whole thing would tip over. Or if you notice these smokestacks, right? They're burning coal out of that. The coal burns very inefficiently. And oftentimes this steam will lift up burning embers that then go floating off into other people's homes or businesses if they're too close nearby. This is why the first railroads were usually well out of town, far away from homes and manufacturing, and then goods would be taken from the railroad, put on a cart, and then taken actually to where they were fully needed, because these railways were scary and dangerous. Then probably one of the biggest changes to all of communication comes with the creation of the telegraph. Now, this comes about 100 years before the telephone. So telegraph comes first, but this is near instant communication for the first time in human history. For example, if you wanted to send a letter during the American Revolution from England to America, it would take about 3 months just to get there. Now, just imagine if somebody left you on read for 3 months. Seriously, somebody leaves y'all on read for 3 minutes and y'all lose your damn mind. Like, why? Why doesn't she like me? What's going on? Nah. Seriously, 3 months just for the letter to get there. And then if it got there, it didn't sink on the ship or something, and assuming the person got the letter and they immediately replied, 6 months. It took another 3 months to go back across the Atlantic. Jacob, are you going to wait 6 months? If you're in business, can you afford to wait 6 months for an answer?
No.
Of course not. No. By then, the competition has taken over. Trends have changed. That, whatever you're manufacturing, that's out of style now. So you have to keep up with the times. That's why this is going to be so important. By the time of the Civil War, there was actually a transatlantic cable that was laid that spread from England to the United States. And the British were literally reading accounts of Civil War battles as they were happening. Instead of having to wait for a newspaper to come or a letter to come over months, now it's instantaneous, and that is going to elevate the speed of life. So, before the Industrial Revolution, life runs pretty slow. This is much like the medieval world. But suddenly, by the middle to the end of the 18th century, the speed of life is exponentially growing. But this is also going to create new conditions, both for living and working for people in England and wherever the Industrial Revolution goes. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, almost everybody is a farmer. And that means that you get up when you need to. When the cows are yelling at you or the cock crows or whatever, okay? But you are your own boss. If you don't want to get up, then don't. I mean, if you don't want to plant the crops, don't. And then you're going to suffer the consequences. But suddenly now, with the industrial age, now you are no longer your own boss. Other people tell you when to get up, when to be at work, how long to be there. Guys, ladies and gentlemen, the average working shift in the 18th century was 16 hours. That was the standard work shift. Today, it is half that, 8 hours, and that is because of the unions. It's the only reason that you have a reasonable workday. Guys, can you imagine working 16 hours straight every single day for the rest of your life? Guys, that's why you get an education, so you don't have to do that, okay? This 16 hours a day, by the 1900s, the average workday was 16 hours, and you worked between 6 and 7 days a week. Sometimes you got Sunday off, most of the time you didn't. It kind of mattered if it was busy season or not. Anybody want to guess how much you got paid per day for that?
Like $2?
50 cents.
Well, Sean's right. If you were a skilled laborer, you made $2 a day. If you were a skilled male laborer, let me be more specific, $2 a day. Anybody want to guess what the cost of living was in England at that time? Per day? Double what you got paid. And this is why you sent your wife and your children to work in the factory. They made, on average, $2 a week. And so that's why you had more children and sent more of them to the factories. Gentlemen, the average age for starting work in a factory, 8 years old. That's when most children began to start working in factories, especially males. Usually for females, it was a little bit longer, more like 10. They'd be held at home for a variety of reasons. But still, guys, imagine at your age, most of you would have already been slaves to the factory 16 hours a day for half of your life. So when are you going to find time to get an education? When are you going to have time for leisure or friends or shopping or anything? These are incredibly difficult working conditions, very difficult lives. And many of the conditions in the factories were just simply brutal. We know that physical and sexual violence were used against women and children regularly. And here's the thing, if you, Jacob, you object to your boss raping your wife, then you're fired, your wife is fired, everybody in your family is fired, and you're blacklisted. So what are you going to do? You're going to speak out and watch your family starve, or are you going to swallow your pride and let that happen? How do you live with yourself that way?
Be pretty tough.
Yeah. These are incredibly brutal conditions. Today, on average in Southeast Asia, raise your hand if you have an iPhone. Anybody know how long the average shift is for a Chinese worker making that that I
12 hours.
40 straight hours. They work a 40-hour shift with no breaks. They eat at the line, and they're exposed to heavy metals that kill them. Anybody want to know what the average lifespan of a Chinese worker once they enter that factory is? 3 years. But who gives a shit? I get to play with my phone, and that matters more. Nike, don't get me started on them. We can keep doing this all day. Levi Strauss. In fact, the vast majority of the clothing you're wearing right now was made by slave labor. But that's okay because you don't have to see it, right? It's cool. It's all right. I'm woke, but I'm wearing jeans that killed somebody and shoes that killed somebody and playing with a phone that killed somebody. So yeah, you're woke. Right on, man. Cool. Now, the way you spend your money matters. If you don't buy that, people don't die. Think about that one for a while. So we need to talk about what caused this. How did it happen in England, of all places? And one of the biggest reasons is a very rapid population growth. A lot of this is coming out of the discovery of the New World and that Columbian exchange. All those foodstuffs that are coming back to England and to Europe are greatly improving the quality of lives and the length of lives. And so more people are living longer and population starts to skyrocket. Now you can trace this line back almost through all of recorded history, and it's almost flat until about 1800. And then we see a massive spike in growth in population, not just in Europe, but eventually around the world. This is going to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Now you have that ready population to grow, to work in those factories. You still have plenty of people to work the farms, and now you can apply that industrial labor to farms as well. You start creating tractors and seed plows and all these technologies to improve the efficiency of agriculture as well. But it's going to be population growth that is one of the biggest causes of this. England also, like I mentioned before, had run out of their fuel source, so they had to innovate. They also had a lot of money available from the New World. So we often talk about and give a lot of credit to these men, to entrepreneurs. But entrepreneurs can't start what they're doing without the right conditions. England already had a banking system. They had a strong internal system of roads and canals, and that's just going to get better as they, and especially the government, invests in railroads and in telegraphs. If you go to Europe, all of the railroads are owned and run by the government. They're not private industry like in the United States. Anybody ridden on Amtrak ever in their life? Okay. Yeah, a couple of you. Is that your regular choice of how to get someplace? Of course not. It's slow. It costs just as much to ride on Amtrak as it does to take a plane. And it takes so much longer under much less comfortable conditions. That would change if the state owned it, but that's a different story for a different day. But, okay, here's the essential problem with industry. You can create and you can create, but eventually, well, raise your hand if you already own a pair of shoes. Okay. Now keep that hand raised if you own more than one pair of shoes. Why? I mean, I get it. Maybe there are different conditions, but can't you use the same shoes to play basketball as you can when you walk? Sure you could. Do you think those Nike Airs with a little cushion give you more leap? Bullshit. The word for that is advertising. Seriously, I don't care how nice your shoes are. We know from every scientific study, they don't even add a millimeter to your actual jump. Nothing. It doesn't elevate your game at all, but it does elevate Nike's bottom line, doesn't it? So I have to, as an industry, convince you to buy stuff you don't need. And these are those annoying ads on YouTube that you pay premium prices for to get away from, right? But this is what keeps the wheels of industry running here. This is one of my favorite examples. In the 19th century, you start to get catalogs. This is where Sears comes from. Sears doesn't even exist anymore. It's out of business now. But these catalogs were sent all across the United States and in Europe. And you could look through these and you could literally buy anything. Look at these. If you could buy some of these guns for the prices that they had back then, you'd be a rich man. Some of these, look, speaking of shoes, guys, there's the fashion of the day. That's not a lady's shoe. That's a guy's shoe. And some of the weird stuff you can get out of here. Corsets. You could literally get an entire house sent to you by rail. You ordered it through the catalog. Once it got there, you paid for it. It was the Amazon of its day, just much less efficient. But this is all based on convincing you that you needed these things. Do you need a closet filled with shoes? No. Will one do just fine? It certainly does for most of the world, but we've been convinced by this lovely advertising, much of which plays on stereotypes. Or plays on our fears or our hopes. Well, if you have acne, nobody's going to like you, right? Okay, literally everybody's had acne. Is that why your friends like you or don't like you? Because if that's the case, you need better friends. Notice how here, look, this is just clearly deeply racist. You have a Chinese man eating a rat, and that's supposed to be selling you rat poison. Wow. Just straight up racism, right? Here, and you have a lot of what at the time, because there's no regulation, you have what is called patent medicine. And everybody's probably heard of these. These are these crazy cures for everything that ails you. And most of the time they were made up of kind of these mixtures of alcohol, like raw alcohol. They put a lot of opium in it, marijuana, cocaine, like all these drugs that are now illegal. So, Jacob, if I give you a bottle that's filled with cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and caffeine, and you drink it, do you even care if you're sick anymore? No, but it certainly, you feel better, don't you? So it works. Ta-da! You're welcome. Then again, it's going to make you an addict to that drug, and you're going to die now of that disease. The big one in the United States was what was called laudanum. This is liquid opium, and especially women drank this. The wife of Wild Bill Hickok died from an addiction to this. Many women died from addictions to this. This is just raw opium, and it's being sold over the counter. Can you imagine just walking up to your local, 7-Eleven, be like, yeah, I'd like a bottle of raw opium. That seems like a bet. Should my kids be able to buy that stuff? My son is nodding his head, and this is why we have to watch him very carefully. So clearly there needed to be some kind of regulation for this, but early capitalism has absolutely no regulations whatsoever. This is going to start reaching out into all aspects of life. I mentioned before industrialized farming as well. It's also going to lead to new ways of people living their lives and having their lives managed. This is where you get the entire management class that emerges during this period. Middle managers. If you have a job, you're working with somebody who is the manager of that store, but it's really not that powerful, okay? Above them are area managers and regional managers and so on. All of these didn't develop at first, but as business continues to grow, it becomes more and more refined over time. And we get a separation between the different types of work. This is what is now called white collar, because when you go to work, you come home clean. Most people who go to work and get their hands dirty are referred to as blue collar. This emerges really in the 18th and the 19th century as capitalism, as industry becomes more refined over time. But I need you to realize that for the vast majority, can you turn that down? Thank you.
Yeah, that's just I can't do this.
Oh, okay. All right, do your best. For most human beings living in these new industrial societies, these were lives of misery. They're not being paid enough. They're working long conditions in unsafe factories. Let me go back to one of these pictures that I showed earlier. This. You notice that every single girl or woman here, and look at how young those girls are. And this is a textile factory here in North Carolina. You need to realize that on the inside of this, it is louder than an airplane hangar. It's incredibly loud, and all of this is moving constantly. There's no shields, there's no protection between you and the moving parts. Can anybody tell me why all those girls had their hair up in a bun?
So that it doesn't get yanked in and rip it out of their scalp.
Yeah, well, you're close, Tyler. Actually, it didn't rip it out of their scalp. It ripped the entire scalp off. You'd have girls and women who would be scalped because their hair would get caught in these machines. Now, what you need to realize is that those women and girls were required to be back at work the next day, or they were fired. There's no OSHA. There's no protections for workers. Business and industry can do whatever they want. They can pay whatever they want, and they don't have to pay at all to protect their workers. They can just fire them and replace them, no penalties. I don't think this is a world that anybody would want. This is the exploitation of labor. For most people, since you worked a 16-hour shift, you didn't actually bother renting a home or an apartment, and you probably couldn't afford it anyway. So what were created in most of the major cities were what were called flop houses. These were huge apartment complexes or big buildings that were broken up into smaller apartments, and you didn't actually rent an entire room. You just rented a space in a room. Because you only had 8 free hours a day, and that included all sleep, all personal chores, laundry, shopping, anything you needed to do, you had to take care of on your time. So when you came home, oftentimes you just flopped down and collapsed. And then when it was the next person's turn to flop in that same place, they woke you up, kicked you out of bed, and you went back to work, wash, rinse, repeat for the rest of your life. Raise your hand if this is a life that you want for yourself or for your children or for anybody you love. Nobody? In fact, let me show you what Abraham Lincoln called this life. If I could spell right, he called it wage slavery. And honestly, what's the difference between somebody living like this and a slave in a field? What's the difference? Is there any? Well, now slaves don't get paid, right? But slaves also get their material needs met. They get fed, clothed, and housed poorly, but they don't have to pay for that themselves, whereas these workers in factories did. They had to care for and pay for all of their own needs while working and maintaining this kind of a life. And yet, this is going to make many people incredibly wealthy, those at the very top. And eventually, over a long period of time, this is going to raise the standard of living for most of the people living in industrial societies, living in the West. But can you see how this is going to cause discontent? How people aren't exactly going to be thrilled about living like this? And so this is where we start to get more into that traditional idea of what we think of as revolution. Now, nobody, I think, really thought of the Industrial Revolution when I asked that question to start today. You're thinking more like the American or the French, burn it down, guns, killing each other. This is the first major revolution of the modern period, and it's going to lead to all of the others. Let's turn our attention there. Now, as an American, we are all brought up and we are steeped in the American Revolution, or at least the mythology we've been taught about that. Okay? I don't really have time to go in that much detail of the American Revolution, but I will tell you this. In terms of this class and of world history, the American Revolution is not the most important. It was just the first in a wave of political revolutions. So while that is important, I will absolutely prove to you that the French Revolution is going to be much more important in terms of global terms. Americans don't like hearing that, but we don't like hearing a lot of stuff that we don't like hearing. The American Revolution begins in the 1770s. As England was growing in their empire, they simply asked the colonists to pay their fair share. Okay, so the British had fought to protect the colonies, to expand them, and all they wanted to do was ask the colonists to pay for that protection. Jacob, is it reasonable for me to ask you to pay taxes if in exchange for that you get police protection, roads, government, all of the things, EMTs, fire services? Is it reasonable for me to ask you to pay your fair share of that?
Yeah, it depends on the terms.
Okay, what do you mean?
What's the quality of the protection? What kind of services am I getting for my taxes? So
okay, so this is a contract, right?
Yeah.
In exchange for you giving me some of your money, and then you in turn get the services that those monies provide. Sean, what do you want to say?
Sorry, I guess I never put down my hand.
Oh, okay. Sorry. You're cool. So this is a contractual relationship. And this comes out of the Enlightenment. This is the idea that government is a contract between the governed and the government, that you give in exchange for services and protection, you give in return obedience and taxation. You give up a measure of in exchange for living in a civilized society. For example, Taj, I can just see, the man's got anger issues. I'm just messing with you. I'm totally mad. But just imagine, can you go out in the street and just shout anything that you want to say?
No.
You sure?
I could.
Because don't you have First Amendment rights?
I could, but
say again.
Consequences to what I say.
So with every right, there are consequences. I love that you bring that up. I can't just run up to your face and start spouting hate speech. I can, but one, I'm probably going to take a couple of fists in the mouth, and two, you're going to sue my ass for violating your civil rights. As well you should. So this is the relationship of government. So this seems perfectly reasonable. If England is asking the colonists to pay more taxes in exchange for the protections their government provides, what's wrong with that? Tell me what's wrong with that. Seems odd. So what exactly were the colonists so pissed off about? What was the phrase? What's the phrase that is at the heart of the American Revolution?
Taxation without representation.
So this isn't a revolution about taxation. It's a revolution about representation, about having a voice in how you will be taxed, how much you will be taxed, and how that money will be spent. That's the key. Do not let politicians lie to you and tell you this was a revolution about taxation. There have always been taxes, always. Now, usually those taxes were paid in a form of service to the state called corvée labor. Now, in England, for example, in the medieval period, you were protected by a lord. In exchange for months of the year, you worked his fields. That was in exchange for his protections when violent attacks came, okay? So you don't get anything for free in life. You have to pay for it. Roads cost money. Cops want a salary, apparently. They like to eat. Who knew? Firemen need to get paid too. So this immature, and it really bothers me that so many Americans are saying that taxes aren't fair, that they're not just, and they're not right. Read the Constitution. It's the 16th Amendment. It's constitutional. But part of the problem is our original Constitution, the 16th Amendment, talks about a progressive tax. And that means the more money you make, the bigger a percentage you pay in taxes. That is not how it goes today, is it? In fact, most rich people pay zero in taxes. And that was exactly the problem during the American Revolution as well. So it's not about taxation, it's about representation. So as the colonies begin to be asked to pay more and more and have no say in it, and they're not getting in return the services that they demand, they begin to get organized. This elevates to a series of violent interactions between the British government or the British military and the colonists. Probably the single most important of these, or probably the best known of these, is what is called the Boston Massacre. Anybody know how many people died in the Boston Massacre? Jacob?
23.
I love the random numbers here. It's like a random number generator. 42. What? Tosh, you look like you got something.
Was it 4? I feel like it was
Yeah.
a number.
4. Is that a massacre?
No.
How do you make it into a massacre?
You just say it is.
The word is propaganda. In fact, probably one of the most famous pictures that we see from this period was created by Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a member of a radical group that was called the Sons of Liberty. Today, we call them heroes. Back then, the British called them terrorists. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, right? These Sons of Liberty wanted to divide, to become independent from England. My favorite of these was a guy named Sam Adams. He's the guy that will eventually be responsible for one of my favorite beers. That's a different story for another day, though. But men like Paul Revere created these dramatic pictures, and they were published in newspapers. Anybody know who the first man was to die at the Boston Massacre? I bet you Taj knows this one. Crispus Attucks, exactly. What was the color of his skin?
He was black. He was a free African American.
Yeah. How do we know he was a free African American?
Well, one, he was in Boston.
There were plenty of slaves in the North, plenty of them. This idea that there weren't slaves in the North is a lie. There were tons of them. So that's not how we know. Do we know?
No, that's what the history book said.
It's an assumption. We don't really know because we don't know hardly anything about Crispus Attucks until men like Paul Revere and Sam Adams make him this clarion call, this martyr for a freedom that he couldn't even have. Okay. Anybody know what the year is for the Boston Massacre?
1773.
No. You're close. 1770. When does the American Revolution begin?
1776.
Close. It really begins in 1775. So, did the Boston Massacre cause the American Revolution?
No.
Careful here. Before you answer so simply with yes and no, realize that for every historical event, there are multiple causes. There are what are called proximate or immediate. So let's say, like when we talk about the Great Depression, the stock market crash is the most immediate cause, but there are also long-term causes. And when I ask you to write your essays for the exam, you need to be able to show me that you understand the immediate causes and the long-term causes. So for the Industrial Revolution, you've got immediate causes and you've got long-term causes as well. Same for the American as well. The really big moment here Tea Party. After years and years of the British colonists, about 5 or 6 years here of this, of them petitioning England and begging Parliament and the King to allow them to have representatives in England, to have some kind of say in how they're governed and taxed, this Boston Tea Party is carried out by Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty. They break onto a ship. What I really love is they dress themselves up as Mohawk Indians. So this is kind of like if my dad disguised himself as an Indian, okay? So you got a fat white guy that jumps on a boat and goes, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, ooh," and puts on a headdress. Anybody fooled? Like, hey, yeah, that's clearly an Indian, right? Bull, okay? In fact, the citizens of Boston knew this was going to happen. This was advertised in the paper. They called people to come out. There were more than 2,000 witnesses of this. And Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty break onto a private government vessel and destroy the property of a company. Now, today we would call those looters and rioters, wouldn't we? If any of you did this, you broke into a school and you started destroying public property, you're going to go to jail, aren't you? You should. If you break into the Capitol building and you destroy government public property, you should go to jail. So why do we call these guys heroes? Why do we call them and elevate them to the position of a founding father of a new nation? Anybody?
I guess it's because they taught us the information with patriotistic idealisms in mind, trying to make them seem like
So really, it's all just kind of based on perspective, isn't it?
I believe the context is a little different, though.
How so?
I mean, it's a different time. We can't directly relate historical events all throughout history to specific instances in the modern world. I mean, it's kind of a complex question.
Mm-hmm. And what I'm doing there is an example of what's called presentism, is judging the past by today's values. And this is a no-no in historical circles because the past was different than the present. Their values were different. And yet, at the same time, breaking and entering is a violation of the law, right? It's no different then than it is now. Destroying public breaks the law, no different now than then. And we live in a society of laws in which people who break the law should be punished for that, right? So is it really that different? I'm going to leave that one up to you guys to think about. Just recognize that there's a lot of different ways to look at the same event. From the British point of view, these people are terrorists. They're destroying public property. Anybody ever heard of tar and feathering? This is a notorious practice. It comes up in all of these books. And usually it was the Sons of Liberty who would kidnap British government officials and tar and feather them. Does anybody know how hot tar has to be liquid enough to dip somebody into it?
Boiling?
Yeah, what's boiling temperature for tar? Like everybody knows that. It's about 430 degrees. What happens when something that hot gets applied to your skin?
You get burned.
Yeah. Now, is this something we should be praising the founders for doing? Dipping living human beings that they didn't agree with in boiling tar and then rolling them in feathers. By the way, how do you get that tar off? The answer is you rip it off along with the first layers of skin. People died from this. So why do we just cast this off like, oh, they just tarred and feathered and somehow make that worthy of praise? Jacob, does that change with values of today? Was that right then, but it's not right now? Hmm.
I don't know. I'm not in those guys' heads a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. But what would justify that behavior?
Probably some really deep injustices that they felt.
Like having to pay too much in taxes,
Maybe.
not getting representative, not having a voice.
I know there were a lot of instances of like the British burning down churches of suspected insurrectionists, I guess you could say. So I know that there was a lot of antagonism on both sides. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Now that came actually after the revolution broke out. So that's not happening during this period as those tensions are rising. That doesn't happen until actual outbreaks of violence. That doesn't start until 1775.
Gotcha.
So we've run out of time. Over the weekend, think about this issue of perspective. As we're talking about these revolutions, realize that there's a lot of different perspectives, not just about these issues, but about all issues. And we need to try to be fair to all sides, because that's how we really gain understanding. Instead of just using history as propaganda, as Tyler said, or some kind of patriotism, instead we need to gain understanding, because then we can remove the politics from the past and see them as more accurately as they were. All right. Thank you for staying extra. I appreciate it. I hope you all have a fantastic week. Don't forget about your homework that's due on Monday. Keep up with the reading. We'll talk more about the exam on Monday, okay? Be good. If you need anything, love you guys. I'll talk to you later, okay? I'm sorry, Jacob, what were you saying?
I was just saying have a good one.
Oh, thank you very much. See y'all later. Be good. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.